If you can talk a little bit about the theory, you touched on it earlier, and the environment and how we are affected by our environment way back when to now.
Well, the world of our ancient ancestors was a very different environment than the world we live in today. There were no massive chemical concentrations that people weren't able to afford to eat large quantities of animal products. Fresh air was the only kind of air that there really was. Sunshine exposure was necessary because there was no plate glass windows to filter the UVB. So, I mean, the world we lived in was one where the goal was get enough to eat and don't get eaten. And honestly, most human beings never lived long enough to reproduce. They're what we call the losers. But your ancestors were the ones that got enough to eat and didn't get eaten. So they managed to figure it out. And it was a relatively smaller percentage of the total population. Most people died from starvation, predation, and all kinds of other, challenges because it was a very harsh environment that we lived in. It's only in the recent modern environment, really the last 200 years, that people have been able to get access to these highly processed food since the Industrial Revolution. So, you had 100 or 200,000 years of modern humans living in a natural setting of scarcity, and you have 200 years of living in an environment of abundance. And that's essentially what's going on, is we've just fooled our brains because of the dietary pleasure trap. And now the majority of people are overweight or obese. In fact, only 12% of people are metabolically healthy right now, and only 2.7% of people actually maintain what would be considered a reasonably healthy diet, body weight less than 25% for a female or 20% for a male, don't smoke, even the most basic and are moderately active. That's like 3 out of 100 people. The fact is most people may not know anybody that's actually healthy.
Wow, and when you say metabolically healthy, can you define that for our
Essentially
audience?
being, if you're a female, having a percent body weight less than 25% and having normal blood pressure, blood sugar levels, the basic measurements of decent health.
What day, I'm imagine it's days, does fasting stop and starvation begin, that the
So
body?
fasting and starvation are separated by the fact that fasting means there's labile reserves available to burn. If you burn up those labile reserves, you will then begin breaking down your lean tissue. That's called starvation, and then you will die. Now,
What are labile reserves?
labile reserves are like your fat stores, the nutrients that you can
The
mobilize without
reserves.
breaking down your lean tissue or your nervous tissue, et cetera, heart tissue. And so we are very careful to avoid starvation because that would be really bad for our outcome data. And we've managed to do that 25,000 times in a row. We've had 25,000 people come in for fasting, 25,000 people walk out. So we have no mortality associated, even our long-term fasting, which is really quite remarkable when you realize how many sick people we really treat.
Yeah, well, I didn't think you did have any people that starved to death, but I was curious, but like metabolically and just the process of the human. So it sounds like the larger you are, the longer that would take until you got to starvation.
Because you have some people that are they're not big, but they're over fat. So they may not be overweight, but they're over fat. You have some people that are really high BMIs, but they're all muscle. And so they have low percent body fat. So the point is, again, even a skinny male could fast as long as 70 days if you wanted him to. So you've got way more capacity to fast than what we call upon in our controlled setting. So how do you know how long to fast? If you have high blood pressure, we want to fast you down to normal blood pressure so that when you refeed, you don't need to be on medications and deal with any of those issues. We did a study recently with our colleague from the Mayo Clinic on high blood pressure. We enrolled 29 people with hypertension. And during fasting, 28 people achieved normal blood pressure without medication, and one person required 50% dose of medication. And then we followed those people a year later to find out, could they maintain their blood pressure free of drugs, and could they maintain their weight loss? And it turned out that 75% of those follow-up people had maintained their weight and blood pressure. Not all of them had complied 100% with the diet, but they had done well enough with the diet that they had kept their weight down and they'd kept their blood pressure normal. 1/4 of them had some slip and slide issues where they had to go back on medications or they had trouble. So not everybody's compliant, not everybody is successful, but enough of the people are successful, a lot more than the 5% that would be predicted by the medical literature in terms of behavioral changes. And that's a year later. So highly motivated, self-selected people that are well-educated can make radical diet and lifestyle changes. And if they do, they win.
I'm sure that you are familiar with that study that was done 50, 60 years ago with young men in Michigan, I think it was. They were young men and they were put on a restricted diet and they lost a lot of weight. And after that, they were unable, they struggled with dreaming about food and their relationship with food became distorted. And when they started eating again, they had trouble. They often went back over and above their old weight. So there's that. There's that. We've been told that if you restrict too much, then your metabolism will slow, and when you start eating again, you'll put on weight.
So the facts are that metabolism does slow during fasting, but by the length of the fast refeeding, it's back to normal metabolic levels. So there's no persistent or permanent downturning of metabolic function. There is improved absorption and efficiency. So sometimes that's confused because it is easier probably to gain weight on crappy diets when you're healthy than when you're sick. If you get people sick enough, they can even eat a crappy diet and lose weight, but that's not necessarily health promoting. So the point is metabolic rate slows in fasting, it recovers in refeeding, but that's why we require half the length of the fast in a controlled setting. Because when you first come off a fast, your HOMO-IR, your insulin resistance is actually a problem because you're metabolically converting back to burning sugar instead of burning fat. So there's a switch, a metabolic switch that's taking place. But that's why if you control refeeding carefully during that half the length of feeding, you can avoid these problems. If you go from fasting to binging, yes, we absolutely agree that can create problems. It can, in the worst case, result in refeeding syndrome. And remember, most people that are using fasting are not doing it in a controlled way. They skip a few meals because they're trying to lose weight, and they binge eat, and people wonder why they're having problems. And also, it's important not to go back to eating sugar and things that will alter your insulin production and then lead to binging and cravings. You also need to remember that there are contraindications to fasting. Anorexia nervosa would be one of them. People that are in an active phase of binge eating disorder, may not want to use fasting because it can be a trigger. So you can trigger eating disorder and aberrant behavior with fasting unless you have the right patient in the right circumstance and do it properly. For those individuals, you just put them on a whole plant food SOS-free diet and you're more patient and you'll still achieve your goals, especially if you're willing to introduce something like exercise into the regime. That's even better. And if you're able to get enough rest and sleep. One of the problems is people don't get enough rest, and so they're fatigued, and they don't want to exercise. They have trouble feeling good, so they're using food for all kinds of reasons other than nutritional needs. And so, of course, it's a catch-22. And also, they're being told, oh, well, fat's good for you. Take a shot of olive oil. Red wine is good for you. It's got resveratrol. It's good for your whatever, antioxidants. So drink some wine. Oh, chocolate. Chocolate's wonderful. It's full of antioxidants. Have some dark chocolate. That's good for you. So now we've got a chocolate olive oil wine diet, and we're wondering why people are having trouble losing weight. It's like the vegetarians that say, well, Oreo cookies are vegetarian, potato chips are vegetarian, Coca-Cola is vegetarian. You can put a really awful diet together and still be vegetarian or still be, including superfoods. So I think that's where if people really want to think about this critically, they should read our books, The Pleasure Trap and Can Fasting Save Your Life? Can Fasting Save Your Life, excuse me. Because you'll get a really critical analysis. One, The Pleasure Trap, you got Dr. Doug Lisle, who did a great job of really thinking through why people have so much trouble with this. And in the case of Can Fasting Save Your Life, Tasha Myers, who's our director of research, is really skilled because she can take complex issues but describe them in simple terms that even somebody like myself can really understand. So I have to say it's, I think, going to be a really valuable tool for people if they want to get their thinking straight.